The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Elena Hartwell stood frozen at her granite countertop, her weathered hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The glass of water she'd been reaching for sat forgotten as the words echoed in her mind like a slap that kept stinging long after the impact. "Grandma, why don't you just die already? You're just taking up space." The voice belonged to Marcus, her 25-year-old grandson. The same Marcus who used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms. The same Marcus who called her his best friend Grandma and promised to buy her a castle when he grew up. The same Marcus she'd practically raised from age 3 to 8 when his father, David, battled addiction and his mother, Sarah, worked double shifts just to keep their heads above water. Elena's reflection stared back at her from the kitchen window. 62 years old, silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades, wearing the floral apron Marcus used to tug on when he wanted her attention. She looked exactly like what she was, a grandmother who had spent her entire adult life putting everyone else first. But in this moment, she felt like a stranger to herself. The conversation had started innocently enough. The whole family had gathered for Sunday dinner, a tradition Eleanor had maintained religiously for over 20 years. David, her 42-year-old son, had been discussing his latest promotion at the engineering firm. Sarah, his wife, had shared stories from her shifts at the hospital where she worked as a head nurse. Marcus had been scrolling through his phone, half listening, until the conversation turned to Eleanor's living situation. "Mom, we've been talking," David had begun, using that careful tone adult children reserve for difficult conversations with their parents. "This house is really too big for you now. The maintenance, the stairs, the yard work. Maybe it's time to consider something smaller, more manageable." Eleanor had set down her coffee cup slowly. This house wasn't just a building to her. It was where she'd brought David home from the hospital 37 years ago. Where she'd nursed her husband, Harold, through his final illness. Where she'd created a safe haven for Marcus during the most chaotic years of his childhood. Every room held memories that had shaped not just her life, but the lives of everyone sitting around her dinner table. "But this is our family home," she'd said quietly. "This is where you grew up, David. Where Marcus spent his summers, where we've celebrated every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone." That's when Marcus had looked up from his phone, his face wearing an expression of barely concealed irritation. Sarah had shot him a warning look, but he'd ignored it. "Grandma, honestly," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular blend of impatience and condescension that young adults sometimes use with older relatives. "Why don't you just die already? You're holding on to the past like it's some kind of museum. This house is worth like $2 million, and you're just taking up space. We could all benefit if you just let go and stop being so selfish about it." The words had hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Sarah had gasped audibly. David had gone completely still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. But Marcus had just shrugged and returned his attention to his phone, as if he'd simply commented on the weather rather than delivering a death wish to the woman who'd sacrificed years of her life to raise him. Eleanor had smiled then, not a happy smile, but something else entirely, a smile of sudden, crystal-clear understanding. "Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories." To understand how deeply Marcus' words cut, you need to know what my life looked like before that moment. For 40 years, I was the beating heart of the Hartwell family. Not by choice, really, but by necessity. When life fell apart for the people I loved, I was the one who picked up the pieces and somehow made them whole again. It started when David was just 22 and struggling with prescription pain medication after a construction accident. What began as legitimate pain management spiraled into something darker, something that consumed his paycheck and nearly destroyed his marriage to Sarah. I watched my son disappear into himself while Sarah worked doubles at the hospital, trying to hold their world together with sheer determination and coffee-fueled exhaustion. That's when 3-year-old Marcus came to live with me. Not officially, not through any legal arrangement, just a quiet understanding that Grandma's house was where safe things happened, where meals appeared on time, where bedtime stories were never skipped, where someone always had time to listen to the important news about playground adventures and imaginary friends. My modest two-story colonial became the family headquarters by default. The spare bedroom filled with Marcus toys and tiny clothes. The refrigerator was covered with his finger paintings and preschool achievements. The living room was rearranged around building blocks and picture books. I was 57 then, thinking I'd finished raising children. But love doesn't follow convenient timelines. "Grandma, look what I made," Marcus would shout, bursting through my front door every afternoon, his Batman backpack dragging behind him. He'd show me paper plate masks and macaroni art with the same pride other people reserved for Nobel Prizes. I'd hang every single creation on my kitchen bulletin board, creating a rotating gallery of childhood masterpieces. Summer evenings were magical. We'd build elaborate blanket forts in the living room using dining room chairs and every spare sheet I owned. I'd make popcorn in my old-fashioned popper, the kind that required oil and actual kernels, and we'd eat it by the bowlful while reading stories by flashlight. On special nights, we'd bake chocolate chip cookies at 10 o'clock, breaking every reasonable bedtime rule, because some memories are worth a little chaos. "Grandma, when I grow up, I'm going to buy you a castle," Marcus announced one night when he was 6, chocolate smeared across his cheek, his hair sticking up in impossible directions. "Oh, sweetheart," I'd laughed, pulling him closer on the couch. "I already have everything I need right here with you." And I meant it. Those weren't just words to comfort a child. In that moment, surrounded by cookie crumbs and construction paper crafts, I felt genuinely wealthy. Not because of my modest savings account or my paid-off mortgage, but because I was needed. Because I was building something that mattered. By the time David got clean and Sarah's career stabilized, Marcus was 8 and firmly rooted in the rhythm of our life together. Even after he moved back home with his parents, my house remained the gathering place. Every Sunday dinner happened at my table. Every birthday party filled my backyard. Every holiday morning started in my living room with present opening chaos and too much coffee. I made tuition payments without being asked. I showed up at every soccer game, every school play, every graduation. When Marcus got his first job in tech, I was the first person he called. When he bought his first car, he drove it straight to my house to show me. I wasn't just his grandmother. I was his safe harbor, his biggest cheerleader, his guaranteed source of unconditional love. Looking back now, I realize I'd built my entire identity around being indispensable to my family. I measured my worth by how much they needed me, how often they called, how completely I could solve their problems. I thought that love and sacrifice were the same thing. I was about to learn how wrong I'd been. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in so gradually that I almost missed it. Like the way autumn steals summer 1 degree at a time until you suddenly realize you need a sweater. Marcus was 23 then, 2 years into his software development job at a tech startup downtown. He'd grown into the kind of young man that made my heart swell with pride, tall like his father, but with his mother's quick smile and sharp intelligence. But something was different during our Sunday dinners. Where he used to bound through my front door with stories about his week, now he arrived looking at his phone, earbuds still in, barely acknowledging my greeting hug. The conversations that once flowed easily between us had become stilted, filled with awkward pauses, where his attention clearly wandered. It was a crisp October evening when I first felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The whole family had gathered as usual. David was carving the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon perfecting. Sarah was sharing stories from her hospital rounds, and Marcus was picking at his food while scrolling through what looked like work emails. I'd been feeling particularly lonely that week. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door for 15 years, had passed away suddenly. We'd shared morning coffee on our respective porches and evening conversations over the fence about our gardens. Her death had left a hollow space in my daily routine that I was struggling to fill. "I've been thinking," I said during a lull in the conversation, setting down my water glass carefully. "Maybe I should get a small dog for company. Nothing too big or energetic, just something to keep me from rattling around this house alone." The words hung in the air for a moment. Sarah looked up from cutting her meat, her expression thoughtful. David paused mid-chew, considering, but Marcus didn't even lift his eyes from his phone screen. A dog, Sarah said gently. That could be nice, Eleanor. What kind were you thinking? Maybe a cocker spaniel or a small terrier. I continued, warming to the subject. Something that would enjoy sitting in the garden with me, maybe going for short walks around the neighborhood. That's when Marcus finally looked up, but his expression wasn't the supportive smile I'd been hoping for. Instead, his eyebrows were raised in what looked uncomfortably like disbelief. "Grandma, you're 62, he said, his tone carrying an edge I'd never heard directed at me before. Do you really want to be cleaning up after a puppy, training it, dealing with accidents, vet bills, all that responsibility?" The dismissal in his voice hit me like cold water. This wasn't concern for my well-being. It was judgment of my capabilities, as if my age had somehow made me incompetent to care for a small animal. "Marcus has a point, Mom," David added quickly, though his voice was gentler than his son's. "Puppies are a lot of work, and if something happened to you, we have to figure out what to do with the dog." "I suppose you're right," I heard myself saying, though something inside me rebelled against the words. When had I started asking permission to make decisions about my own life? When had my family started viewing me as too frail to handle basic responsibilities? Sarah shot Marcus a look that suggested she disagreed with his approach, but she didn't contradict him. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself sitting there in silence, replaying Marcus's words in my mind. "You're 62. As if that was some kind of expiration date, as if I'd crossed some invisible line from capable adult to burdensome obligation. I made excuses for him that night, lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He was stressed from work. He was young and didn't understand how lonely the house felt without Harold. He was just being practical. But deep down, something had shifted. For the first time in my life, my grandson had made me feel old. The months that followed felt like watching myself disappear in slow motion. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just a gradual fading, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The family dinners continued, but my role in them shifted from participant to background fixture. I began to notice things I'd been blind to before, patterns that had probably been developing for years. It started with the stories. I'd always been the family historian, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who could tell you exactly what happened at Marcus's 5th birthday party, or the Christmas when David got his first bicycle. But when I try to share these memories now, I could see eyes glazing over, polite nods replacing genuine interest. "Oh, that reminds me of when Marcus was 7 and he tried to build that rocket in the backyard," I said one Sunday, smiling at the memory of his determined little face covered in dirt and disappointment when his creation refused to launch. Marcus barely glanced up from his phone. "MHM," he murmured, his fingers continuing their endless dance across the screen. Sarah tried to look interested, but I could see her attention drift to David, who was discussing some work project with enthusiasm he used to reserve for my stories. I let my voice trail off mid-sentence, and nobody seemed to notice. The conversations increasingly revolved around their lives, while mine became irrelevant. Marcus's latest coding project dominated entire dinners. David's promotion track at the engineering firm required detailed analysis. Sarah's challenging cases at the hospital deserved careful consideration and advice. But when I mentioned starting a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd been excited about for weeks, the response was tepid at best. "That's nice, Grandma," Marcus said without looking up, then immediately pivoted to David. "Dad, did you see that article about the new Tesla model? The range on the battery is incredible." And just like that, my small victory, my tentative step toward a new hobby, was dismissed and forgotten. I sat there holding my coffee cup, feeling invisible at my own dinner table. The physical manifestations of this emotional eraser surprised me. I started measuring my words before speaking, editing my thoughts down to what I hoped might hold their attention. My voice grew quieter, as if I was afraid of taking up too much space in conversations. I began clearing the table while others were still eating. Anything to feel useful, to justify my presence in the room. "Mom, you don't have to do that right now," David would say when I reached for empty plates. But it wasn't said with affection. It was said with the mild irritation of someone whose rhythm had been interrupted. Even my questions about their lives, which used to spark animated discussions, now felt like intrusions. When I asked Marcus about his girlfriend, Emma, whom I'd met only briefly, he gave me one-word answers. When I inquired about Sarah's new supervisor at the hospital, she responded with polite but distant summaries that made it clear she didn't want to elaborate. I found myself sitting through entire dinners saying almost nothing, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments like an audience member at a play I wasn't part of. The worst part was that nobody seemed to notice the change. My silence didn't create awkward pauses or concerned inquiries. It was simply accepted, maybe even preferred. I started dreading Sunday dinners, which felt like betraying everything I'd built over the years. These gatherings had been my joy, my purpose, my connection to the people I loved most. Now they felt like endurance tests where I had to earn my right to exist in the same room as my own family. Late at night, I'd lie in bed replaying conversations, wondering when I'd become so forgettable, so easy to overlook. I was becoming a ghost in my own life. And the most terrifying part was how natural it felt to everyone else. Marcus' 25th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration. I'd been planning for weeks, excited to contribute something meaningful to mark this milestone. He was my first grandchild, the little boy who used to help me measure flour and crack eggs, who always insisted on licking the mixing spoon. I wanted to honor those memories with something made from the heart. I spent 2 full days perfecting his favorite chocolate cake, the same recipe I'd been making for him since he was 3 years old. Rich dark chocolate layers with cream cheese frosting, decorated with the kind of careful piping work I'd learned from my mother decades ago. Every detail mattered. The precise temperature of the oven, the exact timing of each layer, the way I folded in the chocolate chips he used to sneak from the bag when he thought I wasn't looking. The party was at David and Sarah's house, their modern open-concept space filled with Marcus coworkers and college friends. Young professionals in crisp shirts and designer jeans discussed cryptocurrency and startup ventures over craft beer and wine. I felt overdressed in my Sunday best, carrying my homemade cake in the same glass pedestal dish I'd used for every family celebration for 30 years. "Oh, Eleanor." Sarah's voice carried that particular note of surprise mixed with polite dismay. "You didn't need to bring anything. We had everything covered." I looked past her into the kitchen, and my heart sank. There, taking up the entire center of their granite island, sat a 3-tier architectural masterpiece from Bella Vista Bakery. The kind of cake that costs more than my monthly grocery budget. Modern geometric patterns in metallic gold with Happy 25th Marcus, written in elegant script across pristine white fondant. "I just thought Marcus might like his favorite chocolate cake," I said quietly, suddenly aware of how homemade my creation looked beside their sophisticated confection. The piping work I'd been so proud of now seemed amateur, the slightly uneven layers embarrassingly obvious. "Of course he will," Sarah said with forced enthusiasm. But she was already clearing space on the side counter away from the main display. My cake, which had been meant as the centerpiece of the celebration, was relegated to a corner like an afterthought. I watched the party unfold from the periphery, holding my small plate of food and trying to blend into the background. The professional photographer Sarah had hired captured every moment around the bakery cake. Marcus blowing out candles, the group shots of laughing friends, the careful cutting ceremony. My cake sat untouched throughout the entire evening, its cheerful chocolate layers ignored by guests who had unlimited access to the stunning alternative. The moment that shattered me came when I overheard Emma, Marcus's girlfriend, whispering to her friend near the wine table. "Is that supposed to be a birthday cake, too?" Emma asked, gesturing toward my creation with barely concealed amusement. Her friend glanced over and suppressed a giggle. "It looks like something from a church bake sale. So vintage." They dissolved into quiet laughter, the kind that feels sharp even when you're not meant to hear it. I stood there with flowers still embedded under my fingernails from 2 days of careful preparation, feeling every bit of my 62 years settle into my bones like lead weights. Marcus never even acknowledged my cake. When I approached him later in the evening to say goodbye, he was surrounded by friends discussing some app they were developing. He gave me a distracted hug and thanked me for coming, but his eyes were already looking past me to more interesting conversations. I drove home that night with my untouched cake sitting in the passenger seat, its bright yellow, "Happy birthday, Marcus" message now feeling like a monument to my own irrelevance. I'd spent 2 days pouring love into something that no one wanted. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be completely unnecessary. The cake sat in my refrigerator for a week before I finally threw it away, its sweetness turned bitter by neglect. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 weeks after Marcus's birthday party. I'd been replaying that evening in my mind constantly, trying to understand when I'd become so expendable to the people I'd spent my life nurturing. The humiliation had settled into something deeper, a growing awareness that my place in this family had fundamentally shifted. David called on a Tuesday morning and asked if the whole family could come over for dinner. "We need to talk about some things, Mom," he said, using that careful tone I'd learned to dread. "About your future." My future? As if it was something to be managed by committee rather than lived by me. They arrived that evening with the solemnity of a business meeting. Marcus wore his work clothes, a button-down shirt, and slacks that made him look older, more serious. Sarah carried a folder of papers. David had that expression he'd worn as a child when he was about to confess to breaking something valuable. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Marcus with homework for years, where we'd eaten countless meals together, where I'd listened to their problems and celebrated their victories. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was both defendant and judge. "Mom," David began, spreading some papers across the wooden surface. "We've been doing some research about housing options for seniors. We think it's time you seriously considered making a change." The papers were glossy brochures for retirement communities, pictures of smiling elderly people playing cards, attending exercise classes, eating meals in communal dining rooms. Everyone looked happy in that artificial way of stock photography, but all I could see were people who'd been gently pushed aside by families who'd outgrown them. "This house is too much for you now," David continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his prepared speech. "The maintenance, the yard work, the stairs. You're 62, Mom. What happens if you fall? What if something breaks and you can't fix it? We worry about you rattling around in here, all alone." I looked around my kitchen, at the window where I watched birds that the feeder Harold had built for me, at the corner where Marcus used to do puzzles on rainy afternoons, at the doorframe still marked with pencil lines tracking David's growth through childhood. "But this is our family home," I said quietly. "This is where you grew up, David. Where Marcus spent his summers learning to ride his bike in the driveway. Where we've celebrated every Christmas, every milestone." Sarah leaned forward with practiced compassion. "Eleanor, we understand this is emotional, but we have to be practical. These communities have activities, medical staff on call, people your own age. You'd have a social life again." "I have a social life," I protested. Though even as I said it, I realized how hollow it sounded. Mrs. Patterson was gone. My book club had disbanded when 3 members moved to Florida. My social life consisted mainly of waiting for their visits. That's when Marcus spoke up, and his words hit me like ice water. "Grandma, honestly, why don't you just die already?" His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather. "You're holding on to the past like it's some kind of museum. This house is worth like $2 million, and you're just taking up space. We could all benefit if you just let go and stop being so selfish about it." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went white. David's mouth fell open, his prepared speech forgotten, but Marcus just sat there completely unbothered by the devastation he'd just unleashed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. I felt something break inside me. Not my heart that had been cracking for months, something deeper. The last threads of need, of desperate hope for their approval, snapped cleanly. And then to everyone's surprise, including my own, I smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter one, a smile of perfect crystal clarity. For the first time in years, I could see everything exactly as it was. After they left that night, the silence in my house felt different. Not peaceful like it used to be, but hollow and echoing, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the cruelty of Marcus' words and were reflecting it back at me. I sat at my kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring at the glossy retirement community brochures they'd left behind, like evidence of my obsolescence. The house that had always felt like a warm embrace now seemed to mock me with its emptiness. Every room told the story of a woman who had poured her life into other people, only to discover that love has an expiration date when you're no longer useful. I walked through the hallways like a ghost haunting her own life, touching surfaces that suddenly felt foreign under my fingertips. In the living room, Harold's reading chair still held the impression of his body after 3 years. I'd kept it exactly as he'd left it, down to the bookmark in his mystery novel and the coffee ring on the side table. Now it felt like a shrine to a woman who died the moment she stopped being needed. How long had I been living in a museum of my own making? I climbed the stairs to Marcus's old bedroom, my knees protesting each step in a way that hadn't bothered me before tonight. The finger paintings I'd carefully preserved on his walls for 15 years looked different now. Not like treasured memories, but like the desperate artifacts of a woman who couldn't let go. His Batman nightlight still plugged into the outlet by his bed, waiting for a little boy who had grown into a man who wished I would disappear. Standing in that doorway, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every piece of myself I'd carved away to make room for other people's needs. When had I become so small? When had I agreed to measure my worth entirely by how much others required me? The bathroom mirror showed me a stranger, 62 years old, silver hair, always perfectly neat, wearing the same style of cardigan I'd worn for a decade. When was the last time I'd looked at myself and seen Eleanor rather than David's mother or Marcus's grandmother? When had I stopped being a person and become just a function? I opened the medicine cabinet, ostensibly looking for aspirin for the headache building behind my eyes. But as I stood there surrounded by bottles of vitamins and prescription medications, a darker thought crept in. How easy it would be to just take too many. How simple to solve everyone's problem, including my own. They wanted me gone anyway. Marcus had said it plainly enough. The bottle of sleeping pills sat on the second shelf, the same prescription I'd used occasionally since Harold died. I picked it up, feeling its weight, reading the warning labels with their mentions of dangerous dosages. For just a moment, I understood how people reach the point where existing feels like too much work. But then I set the bottle down and really looked at myself in that mirror, not at the old woman everyone else saw, but at Eleanor, at the woman who had survived raising a difficult child alone when Harold worked double shifts, who had built a successful catering business from nothing in the 1980s, who had nursed her husband through cancer with grace and strength, who had saved David from his addiction through sheer force of will and love. That woman was still in there somewhere, buried under decades of putting everyone else first. Marcus's words hadn't broken me. They had revealed something that was already broken. The part of me that had forgotten I was worth loving for who I was, not what I could provide. I closed the medicine cabinet and went downstairs to make myself a cup of tea. For the first time in months, I was curious about tomorrow. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the fog in my mind as I wandered through my house with a cup of coffee, seeing everything through different eyes. The conversation with my family had stripped away the comfortable illusions I'd been living with, leaving me face to face with some uncomfortable truths about my life. I found myself gravitating toward Harold's old study, a room I'd barely entered since his death 3 years ago. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and the pipe tobacco he'd snuck occasionally, despite my protests about his health. His oak desk sat exactly as he'd left it, papers scattered across the surface, reading glasses perched on top of a stack of financial documents he'd been reviewing before his final hospital stay. I'd been meaning to organize his papers for years, but every time I started, the task felt overwhelming. Today, though, I needed something to occupy my hands while my mind processed everything that had happened. I pulled out the bottom desk drawer, expecting to find the usual collection of old receipts and warranty cards. Instead, I discovered a manila folder labeled Eleanor Important in Harold's careful handwriting. My heart skipped as I opened it, not sure what I might find inside. The first document took my breath away. It was our life insurance policy, but not the modest coverage I'd assumed we carried. Harold had maintained a $500,000 policy on his life, with me as the sole beneficiary. I'd received the payout 3 years ago, but had never really focused on the amount. Grief had made financial details seem insignificant. Beneath that were property tax assessments showing our house was now worth $2.1 million, far more than the $180,000 we'd paid for it 35 years ago. Investment statements revealed accounts I'd forgotten existed for 1K rollovers and CDs that had been growing quietly for decades. When I added everything together, the numbers made me dizzy. I was worth $2.3 million. But it was the handwritten letter at the bottom of the folder that made me cry. Harold's distinctive script dated just 2 months before his diagnosis. My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably cleaning out my mess of papers again. I should have organized this better, but you know how I am with filing systems. I could hear his voice so clearly in those words, see his sheepish grin when he'd leave important documents scattered around his desk. I want you to know that everything we built was for you first. You sacrificed your dreams to raise our son and help raise his children. You closed your catering business when David needed you during his troubles. You put your art aside when I got sick. You've spent 40 years making everyone else's life easier, but don't you dare sacrifice your worth for people who can't see it. My hand trembled as I continued reading. You are not an obligation, Ellie. You are not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. You are a treasure. And if anyone in our family makes you feel otherwise, then they've forgotten where they came from and what you've given them. This money isn't just numbers on paper. It's your freedom. Your chance to remember who Eleanor was before she became everyone else's answer to everything. The letter was signed with his usual, "All my love, Harold," followed by a postscript that made me laugh through my tears. P.S. That boy Marcus better treat you like the queen you are, or I'll come back and haunt his PlayStation. I sat in Harold's chair, holding that letter, feeling something shift inside my chest. For the first time since his death, I felt him with me again. Not as a memory, but as a voice reminding me of truths I'd forgotten. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't a burden taking up space. I was Eleanor Hartwell, and I had choices. Harold's letter changed everything, but not all at once. It was like watching the sun rise, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. I spent the rest of that morning sitting in his study, reading his words over and over until they became a part of me. Each time through, I heard different inflections, remembered different moments when he tried to tell me these same truths while he was alive. You closed your catering business when David needed you during his troubles. I'd forgotten that Harold had objected to that decision. Ellie's Kitchen had been thriving in the late 1990s, catering small weddings and corporate events throughout the county. I'd built it from nothing, starting with church potlucks and growing through word of mouth until I had a waiting list 3 months long. But when David's addiction spiraled and Marcus needed stability, I'd quietly closed the business, without a second thought. That's what mothers do, I'd told Harold when he questioned my decision. Family comes first. What about what Eleanor needs? He'd asked, but I'd brushed off his concern. There would be time for my dreams later, I'd thought, after everyone else was settled and secure. Now, sitting in his chair with 25 years of hindsight, I realized that later comes unless you fight for it. I walked to my laptop, the same one Marcus had insisted on buying me 2 years ago, so you can stay connected, Grandma, and opened a browser window. For the first time in decades, I wasn't researching something for someone else. I was exploring possibilities for Eleanor. The search started simple: active adult communities, Florida. But as I clicked through websites, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling like I was researching my exile, I felt a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. These weren't warehouses for forgotten people. They were communities designed for people who still had living to do. Sunset Gardens in Sarasota caught my attention immediately. The photos showed art studios with easels positioned to catch morning light, cooking classes where residents learned cuisines from around the world, and travel clubs planning adventures to places I'd only read about in magazines. There was a book club, a gardening society, even a business entrepreneurs group for residents starting new ventures. One photo stopped me cold: a silver-haired woman about my age standing proudly beside an easel, holding a paintbrush like a magic wand. Her painting was a vibrant seascape that seemed to dance with life and color. The caption read, "Margaret Thompson, age 68, discover her passion for watercolors after moving to Sunset Gardens 2 years ago." I stared at that photo for 15 minutes, seeing myself in Margaret's confident smile. When was the last time I'd held a paintbrush? When had I stopped dreaming in colors and started living in beige? The community center's website mentioned piano lessons for beginners, and I found myself remembering the old upright piano in my childhood home, how I'd begged my parents for lessons they couldn't afford. Maybe when things settle down, my mother had always said. It seemed like when things settle down was a family tradition of deferring dreams. I opened a new browser tab and searched Learn Piano at 60. Hundreds of articles appeared with encouraging titles. "It's never too late to start. The benefits of learning music as a senior from beginner to pro in your golden years," and real people sharing real stories of discovering talents they never knew they had. By afternoon, I had 17 tabs open on my laptop. Travel websites showing guided tours of Ireland and Scotland, art supply stores with beginner painting kits, community colleges offering everything from pottery to creative writing, and dating websites for mature adults that made me blush and laugh at the same time. For the first time in years, I was imagining a future that belonged to me. Not as David's mother or Marcus's grandmother, but as Eleanor, a woman with her own dreams, her own interests, her own right to take up space in the world. The fire that had been dimmed to barely glowing embers was finally catching again. The transformation didn't announce itself with fanfare. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved through my days with the quiet efficiency of someone who had finally found her purpose. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning with a sense of mission that had nothing to do with what other people needed from me. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Mills, a family lawyer who had helped Harold and me update our wills 5 years earlier. Patricia was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her practice on helping people navigate life's major transitions. When I scheduled the appointment, I simply told her receptionist I needed to review some documents. "Eleanor, how lovely to see you," Patricia said when I arrived at her downtown office the following Tuesday. "How are you adjusting? I know these past few years since Harold's passing have been difficult." "Actually, Patricia, I'm adjusting better than I expected," I replied, setting my purse down carefully and meeting her eyes with a steadiness that surprised us both. "I need to make some significant changes to my estate planning." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Of course. What kind of changes are you considering?" I opened the folder I'd prepared, filled with documents I'd organized over the weekend. "I want to update my will completely, change the beneficiaries on my investment accounts, and I need advice about putting certain restrictions on my property inheritance." For the next 2 hours, we went through everything methodically. The house would go to David and Marcus, but with a deed restriction preventing its sale for 5 years and requiring it to remain a family residence. My liquid assets would be divided between charitable organizations, a nursing scholarship fund in Sarah's name, a technology education program in Marcus's name, and the remainder supporting various causes I'd researched carefully. "Eleanor," Patricia said carefully as we reviewed the documents, "these are quite significant changes. Are you sure about this? This essentially means your family will inherit responsibility rather than wealth." "Exactly," I said, signing each page with deliberate strokes. "I've decided my money should go to people who are actually building something meaningful, not waiting for someone to die." The most satisfying signature was on the power of attorney revocation. For 3 years, David had held medical and financial power of attorney, a precaution Harold had insisted upon before his death. "Just in case something happens to you, Ellie," he'd said, never imagining those powers might be used to pressure me into decisions I didn't want to make. While Patricia handled the legal paperwork, I began making other arrangements. I called Sunset Gardens and scheduled a visit for the following week. The community director, Mrs. Rodriguez, sounded genuinely excited to show me around. "We have a lovely 2-bedroom unit available with a view of the bay," she said. "It even has a small studio space, perfect for art projects." I opened a new bank account at a different branch, one closer to where I'd be living. I arranged for a moving company to provide estimates. I researched auto transport services for my car and began systematically donating items I wouldn't need in my new life. The most liberating moment came when I sat down with my address book and started making calls to old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Women from my catering business days, neighbors who'd moved to warmer climates, college friends I'd promised to keep in touch with, but never had. Eleanor. Eleanor Hartwell. My friend Linda gasped when I reached her in Arizona. Oh my goodness, it's been years. How are you? I'm planning to start living again, I told her. And for the first time in months, I heard myself laugh with genuine joy. I didn't tell my family about any of it. They'd been so eager to manage my life and make decisions about my future. Now they could discover those decisions had already been made by me. For me, every signature, every phone call, every small arrangement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away years ago. I wasn't striking back in anger. I was simply choosing Eleanor for the first time in decades. The first crack in their comfortable assumptions appeared on a Thursday evening in early November. David called around 6 o'clock, using the casual tone he reserved for routine family business. Hey Mom. Just checking in. Marcus got that promotion at work he's been hoping for. And Sarah's planning a little celebration dinner this Saturday. Can you bring that spinach salad you make, the one with the strawberries? I was sitting in my newly organized living room, surrounded by boxes labeled Donate and Sarasota, feeling more energized than I had in months. The request that would have sent me scrambling to the grocery store just weeks ago now felt like an interruption to more important plans. Actually, David, I won't be able to make it, I said, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. I have other commitments this weekend. The pause on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted from casual assumption to confused surprise. Other commitments? Mom, this is important to Marcus. He's been working toward this promotion for months. I'm sure he has, I replied, taking a sip of the herbal tea I'd been experimenting with since starting my new morning routine. Please give him my congratulations. I'm sure he'll enjoy celebrating with the people who matter most to him. There was something deliciously freeing about that conversation. For decades, my calendar had been entirely at their disposal, my time assumed to be available whenever they needed it. The idea that I might have plans of my own, priorities that didn't revolve around their schedules, seemed to genuinely confuse David. The truth was, I did have other commitments. That Saturday, I was driving to Sarasota for my tour of Sunset Gardens. Mrs. Rodriguez had arranged for me to meet current residents, attend an art class, and have lunch in their dining room. For the first time in years, I was doing something entirely for myself, and it felt revolutionary. The shift became more apparent as the weeks progressed. When Sarah called to ask if I could babysit her friends' children during their anniversary weekend, I politely declined, explaining I had enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center. When Marcus texted asking if I could help him move some furniture to his new apartment, I suggested he hire movers and send him the contact information for a reliable company. Since when do you have a social life? Marcus asked during one phone call, his tone mixing confusion with what sounded suspiciously like irritation. You're never available anymore. I've always had interests, Marcus, I said calmly. I just prioritized other people's needs for a very long time. I'm correcting that imbalance now. The real shock came when I missed David's birthday dinner entirely. I'd been attending a gallery opening with my new art class, standing in front of magnificent paintings and discussing technique with people who shared my newfound passion. When David called the next day, his voice carried a hurt I hadn't heard since he was a child. Mom, we waited for you. Sarah kept dinner warm for an extra hour. Marcus kept checking his phone to see if you'd called. I'm sorry you were disappointed, I said, and I genuinely meant it. But I didn't promise to be there. I've learned not to make commitments I'm not excited to keep. What's gotten into you lately? David asked. And for the first time in our relationship, he sounded almost lost. You're acting like a completely different person. Maybe I'm acting like myself for the first time in decades, I replied. And, David, I rather like who that person is turning out to be. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They had built their expectations around a version of me that no longer existed, and they were finally beginning to realize that Eleanor had left the building. What they didn't know yet was that she wasn't coming back. The dinner invitation arrived by text message from Sarah. Family dinner this Sunday at your place, 6 p.m. We need to talk. No question mark. No. Would you mind hosting? Just an assumption that my dining room was still available for their convenience whenever they deemed it necessary. This time I didn't decline. I had something to say, too. I spent Saturday preparing, but not in the way I used to. Instead of obsessing over elaborate menus and perfect table settings, I focused on what I wanted to accomplish. I prepared a simple but elegant meal: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, and a mixed green salad. Nothing that required last-minute fussing or kept me trapped in the kitchen while important conversations happened without me. Sunday evening, they arrived with the punctuality of people who believe they're about to stage an intervention. David carried himself with the determined posture of a man who'd rehearsed his talking points. Sarah wore her professional face, the one she used with difficult families at the hospital. Marcus looked sullen and vaguely annoyed, as if my recent behavior was a personal inconvenience he'd been asked to endure. We made it through dinner with strange small talk about work and weather. I noticed how they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking, silent communications about timing and strategy. Finally, as I served coffee and the lemon bars I'd made that morning, David cleared his throat. "Mom, we're worried about you. This recent behavior, missing family events, being unavailable when we need you. It's not like you." "What exactly are you worried about?" I asked, settling into my chair with a calmness that seemed to unsettle them. "You're isolating yourself," Sarah said gently. "Making impulsive decisions. We think you might benefit from talking to someone, a counselor maybe, to help you process Harold's death and this transition you're going through." I almost laughed. After months of being treated like my thoughts and feelings were irrelevant, they were suddenly concerned about my mental health because I'd started having a life of my own. "I appreciate your concern," I said, reaching into the sideboard drawer where I'd placed 3 small wrapped boxes earlier that day. "But before we discuss my mental state, I have something for each of you." I handed out the boxes, watching their confused faces as they unwrapped identical sets of keys tied with blue ribbon. "These are keys to this house," I announced, my voice steady and clear. "Consider them an early inheritance." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at his keys as if they were a puzzle he couldn't solve. David's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Sarah set her box down carefully, her nursing training probably telling her to remain calm during crisis. "Mom," David began slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you were right. It's time for me to make a change. I'm moving to Sunset Gardens in Sarasota next month. The moving truck comes on December 15th. Marcus finally found his voice. "Grandma, wait. When you said I should die, I didn't mean you should actually leave. I was just—" "You were just being honest," I interrupted, my tone gentle but firm. "And I'm grateful for that honesty. You freed me from something I didn't even realize was a prison." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together 30 years ago. "You see, Marcus, you asked why I don't just die already. I realized you were absolutely right. The version of me that apologized for existing, that measured her worth by how much others needed her, that person needed to die. So, I let her go." I turned back to face them. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, authentically myself. What you're looking at now is Eleanor Hartwell, and she's just getting started. The stunned silence that followed my announcement stretched on until David finally managed to speak, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion and what I suspected was panic about the financial implications. "Mom, this is very generous, but we need to discuss the practical aspects. The property taxes alone on this house are enormous, and the maintenance costs." "Oh, there's more," I said, returning to my seat with the composed smile of someone who had thought through every detail. "Dr. Mills will be joining us shortly to explain the complete arrangement." As if summoned by my words, the doorbell rang. I'd asked Patricia to arrive at exactly 8 o'clock, giving me time to set the stage properly. She entered carrying her leather briefcase and wearing the professional demeanor that had made her one of the most respected estate attorneys in the county. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia said, settling into the chair I'd prepared for her at the head of the table. "Eleanor has asked me to review some important legal documents with you." She opened her briefcase and extracted a folder thick with official papers. First, regarding the property inheritance. While Eleanor is generously transferring ownership of this house to David and Marcus, there are some conditions attached to ensure the family legacy is preserved. Marcus leaned forward, suddenly paying attention in a way he never had during my stories about his childhood. "What kind of conditions?" "The deed contains a restriction preventing the sale of this property for 5 years," Patricia explained, her tone matter of fact. "Additionally, the property must remain a family residence during that time. You cannot convert it to rental income or commercial use." I watched David's face as the implications sank in. He was an engineer. He understood numbers. Property taxes on a $2 million house in our neighborhood ran about $18,000 annually. Maintenance, utilities, insurance. They were inheriting a beautiful responsibility that would cost them roughly $40,000 per year to maintain. "But Mom," Sarah said carefully, "we can't afford to maintain 2 households. Our mortgage payments alone." "That brings us to the second part of Eleanor's estate planning," Patricia continued smoothly. "She's made significant changes to her financial accounts and life insurance beneficiaries." She spread several documents across the table like a dealer revealing a winning hand. "Eleanor has established the Sarah Chun Hartwell Nursing Scholarship, which will provide full tuition assistance to nursing students at the community college. The Marcus Hartwell Technology Education Fund will support coding boot camps and computer science programs for underserved students." Marcus's face had gone pale. "What about, how much is left for family inheritance?" Patricia finished his question with professional courtesy. "After the house transfer and the charitable allocations, the remaining liquid assets will continue supporting these educational programs in perpetuity." The mathematics were elegant in their justice. My family would inherit a beautiful home they'd have to work together to maintain, just as I'd worked to maintain our relationships for decades. They'd also inherit the knowledge that their names were attached to scholarships helping young people build better futures, something positive and meaningful that would outlast all of us. "Eleanor," Patricia continued, "has retained sufficient assets to support her new lifestyle comfortably. She's also revoked all power of attorney agreements and established a living trust that she controls entirely." David slumped back in his chair, finally understanding the complete picture. "So, we get the house, but we can't sell it, and there's no money to help us keep it. Think of it as an opportunity to learn responsibility," I said gently. "The same kind of responsibility I've been handling alone for 3 years since your father died." Sarah was staring at the scholarship documents. "Eleanor, this is incredibly generous, but why didn't you discuss this with us?" I met her eyes with perfect calm. "For the same reason you didn't discuss your intervention dinner with me before planning it. Sometimes the people who love us make decisions they believe are best for us." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Harold had wound faithfully for 30 years. I could practically hear their minds racing, calculating budgets and trying to figure out how to manage this unexpected inheritance. "The moving truck comes December 15th, I repeated, standing to clear the coffee cups. "You'll need to decide who's living here by then." 3 months after moving to Sarasota, I was in the middle of what had become my favorite part of each day: afternoon painting on my apartment balcony. The January sun was warm on my shoulders as I worked on a seascape that captured the way light danced across the bay during golden hour. My easel was positioned to catch the perfect angle, and I'd learned to lose myself completely in the rhythm of brush against canvas. The knock on my door came as a surprise. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. Rodriguez from the community office, usually called first, and my new friend Margaret, and I had plans for dinner later. I set down my brush and wiped my hands on the paint-splattered smock that had become my uniform, wondering who could be visiting unannounced. When I opened the door, Marcus stood in the hallway looking uncertain and somehow younger than his 25 years. He was holding a small bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite, though I was surprised he remembered, and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, caught doing something he knew was wrong. "Hi, Grandma," he said quietly. "I hope it's okay that I just showed up. Dad gave me your address." Of course it's okay, I said, stepping back to let him in. Come in, sweetheart. Would you like some lemonade? I was just finishing up some painting. He followed me into the bright, airy space that had become more home to me in 3 months than my old house had felt in years. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a spectacular view of the bay. My easel stood in the corner, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion, seascapes, floral studies, and abstract pieces that expressed emotions. I was finally allowing myself to feel. Wow, Marcus breathed, looking around with genuine amazement. This place is incredible, and these paintings. Grandma, did you do all of these? I did, I said, pouring 2 glasses of the fresh lemonade I'd learned to make for my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a different Mrs. Patterson who'd become a dear friend. I started with the beginner class here, but I've been experimenting on my own, too. Marcus moved slowly through the room, studying each painting with an attention I hadn't seen him give anything in years. He stopped in front of a vibrant sunset piece that had taken me weeks to perfect, his expression thoughtful. You look different, he said finally, turning to face me. I mean, you look happy. Really happy. I feel different, I admitted, settling into one of the comfortable chairs I'd chosen myself. Not inherited, not given to me, but selected because I loved the way the blue fabric complemented the view. I feel like myself again, maybe for the first time in years. Marcus sat down across from me, the sunflowers still clutched in his hands like a peace offering. Grandma, I need to apologize. What I said that night about you dying, I've been thinking about it every day since you left. I was horrible to you, and I don't even know why. I looked at this young man who'd once been my constant companion, seeing past his guilt to the confusion underneath. Tell me what you've been thinking about, I said gently. Everything, he said, his voice cracking slightly. How you raised me when Mom and Dad couldn't. How you never missed a soccer game or school play. How you always made my favorite cake, even when everyone else forgot it was my birthday. How you paid for my computer when I wanted to learn programming. And you probably didn't even understand what that meant. Tears had started forming in his eyes, and I felt my heart soften in the way it always had for this boy despite everything that had happened. I think I was angry because I felt guilty. He continued about not visiting enough, about taking you for granted. And instead of dealing with that guilt, I made it your problem. I made you the burden instead of admitting I was being a terrible grandson. I reached across and took his hands, the sunflowers finally finding their way to the coffee table between us. Marcus, you weren't a terrible grandson. You were a young man trying to build his own life, which is exactly what you should have been doing. 6 months later, I stood on my balcony watching the sun paint the Sarasota Bay in shades of gold and coral that would have been impossible to imagine from my old kitchen window. My easel held my latest painting, a bold abstract piece that captured the feeling of freedom rather than any recognizable landscape. Behind me, the apartment buzzed with gentle conversation as my art class friends gathered for our monthly critique session. Eleanor, this piece is absolutely fearless, said Margaret, the woman whose photograph had first inspired me to believe in new beginnings. Look how you've used these bold strokes to convey movement and emotion. I smiled, wiping a spot of cadmium yellow from my thumb. 6 months ago, I would have apologized for the painting's imperfections, worried that it wasn't good enough to deserve their attention. Now I simply said, thank you. It represents how I feel when I wake up each morning. Like anything is possible. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first weeks in Sarasota had been challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Learning to fill my days based on my own interests rather than other people's needs felt foreign at first. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to check if anyone needed anything, then remember with a mixture of relief and sadness that my calendar belonged to me now. But gradually, I'd built a life that fit me like a well-tailored dress. Morning walks along the bay with my neighbor Ruth, a retired teacher who shared my love of mystery novels. Watercolor classes that challenged me to see light and shadow in new ways. A book club where my opinions mattered and my stories were welcomed. Piano lessons with Mr. Chen, a patient instructor who celebrated my progress without making me feel foolish for starting at 62. The phone calls from home had evolved, too. David called every Sunday now, but not to manage my life or solve my problems. Instead, he shared updates about his work, asked about my paintings, and sometimes just talked the way sons do when they remember their mothers are people worth knowing. Sarah sent me articles about art therapy and photos of sunsets from her hospital shifts, little gestures that showed she saw me as someone with interests beyond family obligations. And Marcus. My relationship with Marcus had become something I treasured more than the desperate dependence I'd once mistaken for love. He visited every few months, not out of guilt or duty, but because he genuinely enjoyed my company. He'd grown fascinated by my artwork and often sent me photos of street art and galleries he discovered in his travels. During his last visit, he'd spent an afternoon helping me hang new paintings, and we talked about art, technology, and life with the easy intimacy I'd always hoped we'd share. You know, he'd said while we adjusted the frame on my favorite seascape, I used to think you were just grandma, like that was your whole identity. I never realized you were Eleanor with your own dreams and talents. I'm sorry it took me so long to see you. The evening light was fading now, and my friends were gathering their things, making plans for next week's gallery visit. I walked them to the door, accepting hugs and compliments with the grace of someone who had learned to receive love without feeling obligated to earn it. Alone again, I returned to my balcony and looked out at the water. In the distance, a sailboat moved across the horizon, its white sail catching the last rays of sunlight. I thought about the woman who had sat in that old kitchen 6 months ago, believing that her worth was measured by how much others needed her. That woman had been right about one thing. She did need to die. But in her place had emerged someone I was still getting to know. Someone who painted fearlessly, spoke her mind kindly, and loved generously without losing herself in the process. I picked up my brush and added one final stroke to the painting. A small but brilliant spot of white that caught the light like hope made visible. At 62, I wasn't finishing my story.